Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. If it's okay, I thought I dressed for Texas, but Texas fooled me today. We drove down in a snowstorm, as you can imagine, and we missed one airplane, but we eventually got here. So thank you very much for coming out today, and I appreciate the chance to come and talk to you today about basically what I've done over the last 25 years or so. I mean, I'll try to condense it. It won't take that long to get through 25 years. I'll talk about the behavioral underpinnings of environmental policy, which makes me sound like a behavioral economist, but I'm not really a behavioral economist. It could have been the institutional underpinnings of environmental economic policy, but then it would have sounded like I knew details. I'm not really a detail guy. So it's really the way I think about it and the way I think of the mix of what I do and my mindset of how I approach these problems is to think about it in this sort of Venn diagram. Now, if you've seen me talk anytime in the last decade, I always start with this, but it's sort of grounding because people think that I'm a little more scattered than I really am. I know what I'm up to. It might not seem like it on the outside, but on the inside, I'm pretty well focused. But if you don't see where I'm coming from, it's kind of a challenge sometimes because I'm a little nonlinear, and that's just sort of how it works. So I was trained, like most economists, in this world of markets as our organizing principle and thinking about rational choice theory with the notion that what drives us and what is able to rein in our basic instincts are self-interest driven by competition, and this whole idea that rationality emerges because we interact in active exchange institutions, and whether or not I'm rational, there's at least one rational person in the room that can move the system along. So it looks like we're all rational, and I may or may not be paying attention, but at least somebody's paying more attention than me. And then when I started environmental economics, it was quickly clear that when we started thinking about market failure, we're really talking about missing markets in the error to brew complete contingent claims sort of sense, where, you know, ideally you've got this complete set of contingent claims contracts and you're able to specify them, and as long as you can specify them, you'll be able to create some market out of some missing market, and if you can't, then we need to know why, right? So the original contingent valuation name that came out of non-market valuation came out of this sort of complete contingent claims literature, and they took that name and stuck it onto survey work. So really it's a public opinion survey with a fancier name, contingent valuation, which is now today called stated preferences. And as you start working in this field, and as I started working in it, and working essentially in this little area here, thinking about rational corrections of missing markets and dipping into environmental problems and moving into issues like invasive species and endangered species and climate change and biodiversity and health risks and low probability, high severity event disasters, it became obvious that you spend a lot of time with people where markets are not their organizing principle. It's not even in their radar until you bring it up to them. You know, if you're dealing and thinking and working with ecologists, they may think in terms of energy and relative prices and foraging, but they're not thinking in terms of the way we do of markets as one of the best systems to collect information into one spot that's reflected in the price. And if you're dealing with psychologists or working with psychologists, again, they're thinking at the individual level, and they're thinking about aggregation from a group, from an individual level, as opposed to aggregation through an exchange mechanism. And so you're involved with a lot of people who are not, they don't know why you're operating only up in this world up here. They keep trying to pull you into this world to get to discuss some of the issues that they think are important that you're missing. And being an open-minded sort of guy, I let myself kind of fall into this middle section here to a certain extent as I try to think about problems. And in doing so, thinking about economic insight to sharpen environmental policy and science. And notice I put the science on here because I'm a strong believer in joint determination and feedback loops between the two systems. You know, the ecological system depends on relative economic prices, and the economic system depends on relative ecological trade-offs. And to me, it's important that the science includes the feedback loops. And drifting into this notion of psychological insight mattering to sharpen economic principles, and to what degree. And early on, before behavioral economics became behavioral economics, I don't know if you guys, well, some of you are old enough to remember the Journal of Behavioral Economics was essentially, they changed their name to the Journal of Socioeconomics at one point because they're like, well, what is this? Behavioral economics doesn't really capture it. And then all of a sudden, Thaler and Sunstein, all these guys came in and pushed up the behavioral economics as a discipline. And the Journal of Socioeconomics said, well, geez, now they've changed their name back to the Journal of Behavioral Economics and Experiments, I think it is. But so before behavioral economics really took off, a lot of environmental economists were doing behavioral economics of behavior when they were doing non-market valuation. When they were doing stated preference methods, they'd go out and survey people and they'd find great disparities in interviewer effects. Right? I mean, attractive people got higher willingness to pay than less attractive people. People who are getting interviewed in the rain got lower willingness to pay than people in sunshine. And so they had all these different biases, and if you go back and look at the literature back in the 70s, they identified a whole lot of biases in the 70s and 80s in non-market valuation that you could probably go back, and I haven't done it, but you could probably link them up to a lot of the behavioral biases that we're now rediscovering as we think about behavioral economics. This is a little hard to read, but in terms of the key behavioral patterns, we seem to dislike losses, focus on changes, overweigh small chances, think in these mental accounts, care about other people, and financial incentives seem to crowd out good intentions, and the context of choice matters. So in terms of behavioral patterns that seem to matter and been documented, the question is how much do they matter, and when do they matter, and why do they matter, and who cares if they matter when we're thinking about these sort of events. Now for me, as an environmental economist, I think they matter, of course, because if we're doing non-market exchange, I don't have any mechanism to arbitrage you. I don't have any mechanism to make you rational by getting you to buy high and sell low, right? So you end up being a money pump for me or a Dutch book. So these behavioral patterns, this goes back, you know, Kahneman's thinking fast and slow and all the different types of biases and heuristics we use. These things may or may not play an important role in non-market allocation. If you're a fan of Jack Kniech, the economist from Canadian economist at Simon Fraser, long-time environmental economist. He'd been doing this way back in the early 80s, early 70s, and I think he felt like a man on an iceberg out, trying to make an argument with the economic profession, especially environmental economists, that all these things matter because we're in non-market exchange institutions. And so my pragmatic question was whether or not behavioral economics can help environmental economics provide more protection at less cost, and if not, why not? And if so, what are new policy tools, and can we predict better? By how much? And do we have to reinvent a new baseline against which we judge success in terms of welfare analysis if we introduce all these things into our world? And so the challenge for me, and the way I've thought about this problem, is that if we're typically thinking about rational choice and we got utility as a function of wealth, that's fine. But what we observe is utility a function of wealth and this theta thing I call, and some vector of aversions and emotions. And then I is just the institutional context or institutional design. And this whole theta vector of emotions, and what I'm worried about are how the intersection between institutions designed to deliver non-market goods interact with these thetas. And what sort of gets me here versus here is obviously that's cleaner and simpler, and all I got to do is worry about your wealth and how that translates into welfare. And here now I've got to start thinking about these interaction terms, and I got to think about if everything's context dependent, we've got preferences like a pinwheel, at what point and what day, if we spin the pinwheel and we've got a demand curve that looks like this, and we spin it the next day and it looks like that and it looks like this, and then which baseline, which demand curve are you going to use for public policy? And how do you then identify how big this vector is, how important the vector is, and what sort of ultimately scared me away from wanting to, I do have a psychology minor, from like 1980, but that I don't really feel like a card-carrying psychologist, and I don't want to be a psychologist. I couldn't, in my mind, wrap my head around the idea of trying to explain the cross-partial derivatives within this vector. Right? So if that vector includes emotions like envy and guilt and lying aversion and disappointment, and I don't know, pick your favorite emotion. And the way these models typically work is to pick one emotion at a time and throw it in there like an emotional degree of freedom, pick up a bunch of behavior you can't explain. I just didn't know if being more disappointed increased my marginal productivity of guilt, or if being more envious decreased my marginal productivity of lying. I desperately wanted to avoid this. But at the same time, I desperately wanted to avoid sort of the ad hoc nature of just picking one emotion at a time. Even though I could tell a good story about it, I had a hard time sort of separating out guilt from lying aversion. Maybe you can. I had a hard time. If I lie, am I guilty? If I'm guilty, do I lie? I don't know. Okay, so if we're thinking about all this business about adding behavioral economics into this world of non-market exchange, can we establish a viable and reasonable baseline of which you can judge success and failure? Like any good science, it's got an upper and a lower baseline, and typically ours has been rational choice and random behavior, and thinking about behavior within those two baselines. And now if we're going to introduce other behaviors, what's the new baseline? Thinking about conditions when these preferences are fixed values or these transient artifacts that come and go. Thinking fast and the thinking slow idea. And whether or not the institutional settings allow us to create behavior that will produce the people we assume live in our models. Right? So this is the worst case of trying to make the world more like the models. Right? If my case, I want to make institutional designs so that I push people into a corner so that the world is more like the model, rather than opening it wide up so that I have to have my model more like the world. So if we put this in the context of environmental policy and how I think about it, this is how I typically teach my grad class. What's the breakdown? Market failure, coordination failure, institutional failure, behavioral failure in the sense of non-rational behavior. What's at risk? Health, human health, environmental health. Easiest way to get rid of risk is make it somebody else's problem. So where's the conflict going to arise? Now you got strategic behavior. Can we cooperate? Can we design incentive mechanisms? How do we value these changes? And what does it mean for social order if we organize it in this way? And typically, if you didn't think about behavioral economics, there would just be a column here of rational choice and we'd have different policy options. If you introduce behavioral economics, you've introduced, well, you can kind of lump it into four categories. Bounded rationality, or nowadays some people call it cognitive economics, the idea of using resources in your brain and how much transactions costs are, and the idea you can only absorb so much and you can only calculate so much, back to Herb Simon way back when, and throwing bounded rationality into all these categories. Bounded willpower, your self-control problems, in the sense of, you buy your gym membership and you never go kind of issue, right? Anybody ever gone to stick.com? Anybody seen it? Yeah, so stick with 2Ks.com. You go there, you give them your credit card, and you say, please donate this to a group that I hate. And then you say, I'm going to run a marathon in half a year, and then you have a monitor, and if you don't run the marathon, then it donates $1,000 to a group you hate, right? So it's a commitment device that economists have come up with. It's on the web right now. If you got your laptop open, you can go right there, and and you can, if you're from Boston, you could have the I Love Rush Limbaugh Society sort of thing, you could dedicate it to that if you got to lose some weight or whatever. Bounded self-interest, well that's altruism. The idea we like other people and we're nice to other people. Reciprocal or pure altruism. And then I threw this one in there now, unbounded emotions, because we keep trying to add emotions into utility functions. Being a good Scandinavian, I don't, but other people do. Okay, and so if I thought about this, the two cheers and the one qualm has kind of gone over these. The preference dependence or the context dependence and social preferences. I mean, context dependence is typically a big problem because we've got context independent preferences in our models. Relative prices, income, drive behavior. And once you start introducing context-dependent preferences and these non-monetary context change choices, then I'm a little lost sometimes in deciding how I'm going to evaluate environmental policy, because the baseline's moving on me. And maybe you could do a comparative static, but then again, there's nothing to say that the context is held constant when you change the comparative static. I mean, if you're really going to push it to the extreme. So there's an issue for me in trying to decide how to model this. There's different ways of doing it, different ways of approaching it. Valuation based on context is another story that then becomes, well, which non-market valuation measure to use? Social preferences, you see a lot of this now in terms of social norms and social distance and isolation and punishment and nudges based on these instincts and showing you what your neighbors are doing in terms of energy use, showing what your neighbors are doing in terms of water use, and whether that's going to change your behavior. And then the question is, how persistent is it? If I know I'm always over average, maybe at first I adjust, and then afterwards I just start thinking my neighbors are just stingy, right? I mean, I can rationalize my behavior after a while. Maybe I initially react. And that's sort of the question, is whether these nudges based on instincts and social norms are persistent, or how persistent they are relative to price changes. But this is the one that still gets me as a scientist. We want the two baselines, and then this question here is this reasonable new baseline that we're going to define. And the reason it bugs me is the following. In economics for 200 years, the only thing we were averse to in our models was risk. Pretty much from the Bernoullis, we added a little bit of curvature to the utility function. That handled the St. Petersburg paradox. We're pretty happy for 200 years. And then Ellsberg came along, Kahneman and Tversky came along, and now we're averse to ambiguity. The source of uncertainty matters to us. Whether we lose or we gain, now that matters to us. And for about 20 years, 20, 30 years, this was all we were averse to. And nowadays, we are averse. I just go to Google Scholar and type in economics and aversion. These are just from titles of papers. It's not tax evasion, it's tax aversion. That could be Texas, I don't know, it could be Wyoming. Betrayal aversion, debt aversion, delay, extremeness, stress. I mean, in my mind, that's that vector of thetas. And the more aversions we add, the sometimes when I start thinking about it, I don't even know why I get out of bed, right? I mean, I am averse to practically everything now, no matter what, crowd aversion, right? I mean, speaking in front of big crowds, I'm petrified, right? So how do you include all this stuff in the new baseline? Seems very random, ad hoc, pick and choose. Not saying that the science isn't good, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying I don't know where to pick. So my research choice in my career has been to decide whether to focus on this aversion explosion or to focus on the institutions that work to create the person that we assume, that rational choice person. If I can create an institution that gets people to be rational, my life is way easier as an economist, especially dealing with environmental non-market goods, than it is if I have to explain every behavioral quirk that you may have under every context you may face. Right? That just becomes overwhelming, and then aggregate that up in a non-market context, whether it's voting or whether it's through some kind of public good voluntary contribution scheme. I mean, however you want to aggregate up these preferences that I can't pinpoint. I mean, I can do it in a market. I'm not worried about that because the price is kind of pulling things along. But in terms of aggregating that up in a non-market context, then it's harder for me to get my head wrapped around. And people like Eleanor Ostrom and all the institutional folks who worry about organizational structure, probably have a better grip on it than me in terms of how those rules allow you to aggregate up and how different aversions get filtered out in the aggregation process. But what I want to do is give you some examples today of how I've looked at picking institutions to scrub out these emotions, or picking institutions that don't necessarily reward wearing your heart on your sleeve, or institutions that try to get you to commit to real economic exchange even though you don't have real economic exchange. So I want to focus on three things that I think are pretty fundamental in terms of understanding interactions of people: coordination, generalization, and commitment. Right? These three things are pretty basic in terms of what we're trying to do with non-market allocation and environmental natural resources. Right? So coordination, generalization of learned behavior, and commitment. And I want to give you some examples. The details will be a little bit sketchy, but I can give them to you if you want them, but I didn't think we had time to dig deep into everything and look at it. So the first thing I want to look at is this notion of the agglomeration bonus, and this has been work we've been doing for the last decade. I got involved in endangered species work in the Rocky Mountain West because we were real interested in Texas as a perfect example of public goods being held in private hands. Right? So Wyoming's 50-50 private-public. Texas is what, 98-2? Something like that. I think there's 118 species on the candidate list for being listed as endangered or threatened. I think if we listed them all, we could shut Texas down. I'm pretty sure. I mean, 118, how many of them are in aquatic? A chunk of them. And given water in Texas is kind of testy. Water in the whole West is kind of testy, and you got, my favorite one is the Las Vegas columnist who wrote about the little dace that was in the hot springs as Las Vegas was developing up towards Red Rocks, and they had to stop development. He goes, what scientists call endangered, most people call bait. Right? And so the problem of trying to agglomerate habitat, fragmented habitat, into contiguous land holdings voluntarily on private lands. And so we started thinking about this in terms of an agglomeration bonus. So the agglomeration bonus is just a simple idea of a network externality in reverse, or a man-made network externality. And that what we'll do is if you retire this acre here, this table, and it butts up with this table that's retired, I'll pay you a bonus. I'll pay you extra because it's contiguous to this acre. And if it's contiguous to that acre, I'll pay you more, contiguous to this. And so the idea is to take a subsidy that might otherwise come from Conservation Reserve Program or come from PNC or wherever it's coming from, and instead of just giving it out, we chop it up so that we make agglomeration bonuses contiguous or context dependent on what your neighbors do. So in a way, you don't even have to like your neighbor. You just have to look at the incentives in this game. And so when we first did these experiments, and if you're an experimental economist, you know this, so we had 2-player games, simple 8x8 normal form games with payoff matrix in them that represented behavioral patterns. And we ran these things and we showed how, this could work, and we sent it to the American Journal of Agriculture Economics, and the reviewers all rejected it because it was too simple. That's not how farmers behave. It was too simple of a model. So at the time that said, well, we'll show you. So we designed this experiment. Again, it's been a while when we designed it, but we're still running experiments looking at this agglomeration pattern. We've done it now for a decade. Greg Parkhurst and I, he's at Weber State. And the idea being that we've got 4 landowners, and this is the retired acre, which meets at the 4 corners of the 4 landowners. And we want to do this voluntarily. So spending time with landowners in Wyoming, I mentioned this earlier today and the day before, the 3 things that really seem to matter to landowners in Wyoming is that their privacy is maintained, their sweat equity is protected, and their stewardship is acknowledged. If you can design a system that maintains those 3 kind of constraints, some sort of respect for the landowner, and set up the system, you can create this. Now, here's the problem in terms of behavioral economics. This is a game with 4 players. Now, there's what the agglomeration bonus does. But here's the game with 4 players. 10 by 10 cells. They own 25. They can retire up to 6 parcels. That gives them at least 68,000 some strategies, which leads to 68,000 to 4 potential outcomes. And all we do is give them an agglomeration bonus menu. We don't give them a payoff matrix. We don't give them a normal form game. We just give them a menu that says, we'll pay you this much for a retired acre, this much if it touches your neighbor to the south, this much if it touches your neighbor to the west, this much if it touches an acre of your own retired. So if you're worried about hyper-rationality in game theory, as the only way to solve a complex game, then we should have an utter disaster here. All right, if behavioral game theory, people can't backward induct any more than 2-3 steps, all the potential coordination problems associated with this. Greg went back and calculated the Nash equilibrium in this game, and depending on what pattern we're trying to create, it's somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 Nash equilibria that can exist. You can cluster up at the top and the bottom. There's a million ways to go wrong and one way to go right. And the one way to go right is to nail this, where we've nailed the biological efficiency, we've maximized our biological target, and economic efficiency in the sense that no money's left on the table. We've achieved the pattern we want to achieve. Right? So the first example is, so we got heterogeneous land quality all over here, and we didn't provide a subsidy. We just said retire 5 acres. And you can see people are following a pretty consistent pattern of retiring acres, the cheapest ones, easiest thing to do. So the land heterogeneous. Every cell represents say the egg production value of it. That's what we assume. But we kind of spread it out across. You can see the patterns that are emerging. And this is one example. So this is not average. We just grabbed some examples. Then we paid them a subsidy per acre. And you can see another similar pattern of fragmentation. And again, that was relatively straightforward. We're just going to pay you per acre. Then we introduced the agglomeration bonus with our one target. We didn't tell them the target. We didn't tell them anything about it. other than here's your payoff structure. And in this case, these are University of Wyoming students, 2-3 rounds, and they nailed it. And it's pretty consistent that way. So in this sense, I didn't really have to explain any kind of behavioral anomalies. I had the incentives set up, and I structured the institutions and the rules such that everybody ran to the fence line. Now, did everybody do this perfectly, or did I just pluck this one out at random, or is this a super good example? Well, this is a good example, but pretty much patterns, people figured it out, before round 7, 8, 9, 10. But I mean, they hit it on the bullseye. So for me, I was really sort of grateful that the Pareto dominant Nash equilibria seemed to be the one that attracted these 4 players. Now you could say, well, how do you implement this in the real world? Good question. They've tried it in Finland in private forests over there to some success, where they try to get private landowners to actually set up agglomeration bonuses on how they protect and how they set aside some of the land for forestry. The Germans have tried it for butterfly mowing. They're not mowing butterflies, but they're mowing the field that the butterflies live on, and so they come up with patterns how to keep contiguous fields as they mow around it, so the butterflies can, move across these contiguous fields. So people are actually trying to do this now. They're actually trying to implement it. It makes sense. You got a lot of equilibrium, but the one that seems to work is the one we want. Now, we've done other experiments where we've created corridors, crosses, 4 corners, and those work fairly well too in terms of creating what we want. I mean, obviously, the more complicated you make it, the more you got to fine-tune your bonus and hope it works. The only thing we haven't done here is account for, and this is a big thing, holdouts. If we had endogenous land prices, where if you guys all retired, I held out, and all of a sudden I lived next to a nature reserve. And now my land values go up, and I can sell my ranchettes for twice as much because now I have a nature reserve around me. Ideally, that's what you'd want to do next in terms of figuring out whether or not this is going to break down. But it didn't break down because of a behavioral reason. Then it broke down because of a rational reason of, I'm going to outsmart the system here, and I'm going to wait for everybody else, and then I'm going to hold out. And when we talked to landowners in Jackson Hole, trying to get them to think about this idea, that's what they came back with me saying, no, these guys in Jackson Hole will figure out how to wait. They'll outweight you. These guys are billionaires. They're not in a hurry, right? And then they're smart. And I hadn't thought about the holdout problem. I was so excited about this. I was like, yes. And they kind of brought me back to reality in terms of how you'd actually move it. The next one is an experiment we ran a while ago now that still is one of my favorite papers. This rationality spillovers argument, where what we're trying to do is work in this intersection. And again, the question for me is, environmental policy to me is a lottery. It's a low probability, high severity event, and we do bad in those low probability, high severity events because we decouple probabilities from severity and think about them in sequence rather than consequentially, like expected utility says. And when we think about them in sequence, we can be subject to preference reversals, because then I can get you to value a safe bet more than a risky bet, I can get you to value a risky bet more than a safe bet, but I get you to prefer a safe bet over a risky bet. And as soon as I do that, I can sell you the safe bet, trade you for the risky bet, or the other way around. Sell you the risky bet, trade for the safe bet, buy back the risky bet at a lower price, and I money pump you. Right? So preference reversals back in the 70s were a big thing that came up during nuclear power and thinking about low probability events, and Slavic and Liechtenstein and Plott and Grether tried experimentally to to say these experiments were wrong because they didn't pay money and they didn't do all this thing and they couldn't get rid of them. And then a paper by Chu and Chu just introduced a simple arbitrage mechanism and got rid of all this preference reversal. So market power takes sweeping away these anomalies relatively quickly by setting up this money pump, this Dutch book, so that I can take the money directly from you. And the question we had, or I had, and Todd Cherry had, was whether or not if you had market arbitrage here and you asked people non-market valuation questions here, whether or not the rationality you induced here would spill over to the non-rational choices you were making, or the non-market choices you were making here. So in general, we spend a lot of our time in markets, we spend a lot of our time in non-markets, and if we're conditioned in markets through arbitrage to think in a way of consistency and valuation and preferences match up with valuation, that learned generalized behavior may or may not transfer over to non-market choices. If it does, then again, my models are great, my economic models are fine, I'm happy, I've conditioned you to be rational through arbitrage, and now I'm asking you non-market choices, and now your non-market choices are rational, and again, I don't have to introduce emotions, I don't have to introduce any of this stuff. So we've been pushing this notion of spillovers and rationality crossovers, and that if I arbitrage you in context A, and then I ask you questions about food safety over here, you're more prone to act rational in terms of your valuation in food safety if you're actually participating in a market over here. So what did we do? Well, I just said that. So here's what we did. So here's preference reversal rates in the non-market setting. They're somewhere up here around 40% for real money lotteries. So again, preference reversals. You prefer the safe bet to the risky bet. You put a higher value on the risky bet than the safe bet. I sell you the risky bet. I give you the safe bet. I buy back from you at a lower price. And once we introduce arbitrage here at round 6, you can see we kind of scrub out the preference reversal. So people are acting as if they're rational when arbitrage is hitting you right in the face. Every time you make a mistake, boom, I take money from you. And if you prefer less money to more, there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, I got to turn in my card as an economist at that point, right? The question is whether or not arbitrage happening right here is going to affect how you think about non-arbitrage choices right here. And which way is it going to spill over? Is the rationality going to spill over to the non-market choice, or is the non-market choice, because there's nothing to pin you down, going to spill over to the rationality? I didn't know. We didn't know. We were hoping it would go one way, because then, again, I got a utility function with wealth and nothing else in it. That's what I want. So when we ran these things, and we ran them in the context of designing a non-market valuation survey to value invasive species in Yellowstone. So this was the whole context of it. I wanted to design a survey to value the protection of cutthroat trout in lakes in Yellowstone Lake from being attacked from the lake trout that were introduced in there illegally at some point, and what the impact had on all the other 42 species that depended on cutthroat. So we ran a parallel non-market experiment, again up to here where we introduced arbitrage. First we had real money lotteries with no arbitrage, hypothetical money lotteries with no arbitrage, and then hypothetical wildlife lotteries focused in on grizzly bears and birds of prey and the fish. And for us, the rationality that we induced in market A spilled over to market B. Okay? Again, I was excited. I don't have to explain anything behaviorally. I designed an institution that created the people I assumed existed, even in a non-market choice. Now you say, well, you're just hitting them on the head with a baseball bat, right? I mean, every mistake they make, you just boom, just punish them. Well, sure, then go run a bunch of these where you only punish them every 2 times or every 4 times. I mean, if you want to test the persistence, do it 1 time and see how long it lasts. I don't care. I just wanted to do it to see if it worked. So what we ended up doing is a series of experiments where we just hypothetically explained arbitrage to people. Had the same effect. Once they just were told what arbitrage was, they were like, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden the preference reversals went from 40% again down to 5%, just explaining it to them. Not doing it, not even turning them into a money fund. So is that a information problem, a behavioral problem? It's more of an information problem on consistency of choice. Now, we actually did run this survey. We designed it and ran it through the New York Times website. And, and so we arbitraged people at the same time with these Yellowstone lotteries as they answered monetary lotteries. And then we estimated the demand curve, plugged it into a bioeconomic model, and went through the whole process of estimating all the impacts of what happens when you do different gill netting strategies on the lake trout. And at the end of the day, after all this work, the whole punchline was, forget the fish, fix the roads. Because people are more inclined to be driving through Yellowstone, and they'll look at Yellowstone Lake and go, great, I don't see any fish, I'm not fishing, I got screaming kids, whatever, the fish are in there, the lake's too cold to swim. Just fix the roads. I mean, look how many cars are on here, and look at how jammed we are. So, it was a lot of work to come up with sort of like the duh answer. If you had just gone and talked to anybody stuck in a Buffalo traffic jam, that you might have got the same answer. But from a scientific viewpoint, I can live with it. Yeah, the one part about it is the reaction to this arbitrage was that introducing arbitrage was the economist's defensive posture and a harsh penalty. And I thought, well, no, that's kind of pushing it. We're not being defensive when we introduce arbitrage. That's the whole point of a market, right? I thought that reflected his defensive posture. All right, so let's take a look at this one for a sec. Preference elicitation under oath. And now we're in this sort of area here where we're interested in real economic commitment. And the biggest challenge for non-market valuation ever since stated preferences were introduced back in the 60s with Davis's dissertation. Hypothetical questions get hypothetical answers. And really the big problem is there's no binding budget constraint, and so values can just float off to wherever. Right? And you talk to the original contingent valuation guys, and you ask them, what were you trying to accomplish? And they said that they were trying to accomplish two things when they started off. First, to see if willingness to pay was greater than zero. Second, to see if willingness to pay was less than infinity. All right, so once they bounded it between infinity and zero, then they started worrying about, well, okay, how much can we get this thing to work? Okay, but initially their goals were pretty modest, right? But as you start getting more into natural resource damage assessment and the money gets big and you get Exxon Valdez and you get all the different oil spills and you get the lawsuits and you get all the consulting companies coming in. I remember a lot of our students when they were graduating, when I spent a year in an interdisciplinary school, and a lot of folks got hired working for Arthur Anderson at the time essentially to value fish kill. That was their job. They were consultants to do fish kill. And again, the criticism being no real economic commitment. So what we were interested in is trying to create real commitment, real economic commitment without money, without exchange. And this is when I started hanging out with the French guys, and we started hanging out with a guy, Robert Vincent Joulet, who's a specialist in social psychology, and his thing is writing books about commitment theory and essentially popular books in French about how to get your kids to commit to things and how do you get, like he never says, that was wrong. He says, well, it really doesn't seem like you. Right? That kind of stuff. That kind of framing of how you approach your kids when they screw up to try to get them to commit to be the type of person you want them to be. Or the type of person that gives away something for free, right? The classic is the foot in the door experiment, right? If you're downtown or if you, maybe this weekend in Austin, Yashka will try this. We'll ask somebody for the time before we ask them for $1, right? So if you ask them for the time first, they have just given you the time for free, so why not give us $1 for free? You've committed them to be that type of person to give away $1 or time for free. Now just one step further. And you've committed to be that kind of generous person to give a buck. And as I've said before, I've tried it in downtown Denver with a longer beard. It works. I mean, maybe I just look scary, but it works, with a long. But it does. You can raise. Anecdote for me doing it, but they've actually run these experiments. So what we want to do is introduce this oath, and we want to use this oath as a commitment device. And the oath as a commitment device really is just that, an oath. And so what we had our students at the Sorbonne come in, run an experiment, and they, by themselves, each one came in, the monitor was there, gave them a piece of paper, they read it, and it said, I don't have a picture of the oath right now, but it said, I, Jason Shogren, solemnly swear on my honor to tell the truth. Date it, sign it. That's it. That's the oath. Don't tell them anything about the experiment. Don't tell them anything about why they're doing it. You don't have to sign the oath. It's just an oath. That's all it is. Okay? Now, why are we doing this? Again, we're trying to do this to get them to commit to be the type of person to tell the truth when we run a Victory second price auction. So if you remember a Victory second price auction being high bidder wins, pays the second highest bidder's price, all the incentives weakly dominant to tell the truth, right? If you try to bid too high, you might have bid too much. If you bid too low, somebody sneaks above you and you miss out on an opportunity that would have been profitable. It's a Nobel Prize winning idea, right? To push everybody right down to their value, right? You separate out what you pay from what you say, so you got no incentive to lie, but yet people do. So when you actually run Victory auctions, and you look at sort of the spread of values versus bids, up here at the market clearing price, they're pretty good, but everybody else is just all over the place. Down here, they're just goofing around, whatever, they're bored. I don't know what they're doing. There's a big tail down here off the market clearing price. Well, that doesn't help us for valuation work. We want some paying attention all the way down the whole thing. Okay, so where are we at? That's what we said. Okay, so what we did is we ran some induced valuation experiments and found indeed the oath seemed to work in induced valuation experiments better than real money, as a matter of fact. And so we set up an Adopt a Dolphin fund, and we were interested in how much these students were willing to pay to adopt a dolphin. And so again, we're trying to create something tangible, but yet esoteric. And a dolphin is deliverable in paper form, right? You can adopt it in paper form. You can't adopt Sparky. And who doesn't like a dolphin? Besides fishermen, that might not like dolphins. But otherwise, you got smart French students or from all around the world. How are they not going to like dolphins? Okay. So we got a good that has an ethereal value. It represents nature, but yet it's deliverable because you get a certificate. Okay, and I can't. Now, in some cases, they'll send you a little stuffed dolphin too, but I don't think we did that. Right. So this is what we're auctioning, and so I was telling the grad students when working early on with John List, and he brought in baseball cards. Again, and he said, can we auction these? And I didn't care about baseball cards. I cared about the fact that a piece of cardboard with some pictures on it, or picture on it and some writing could be worth thousands of dollars if it was rare enough I was like, no, that represents something more than a piece of cardboard, right? And it represents some idea. And so we wanted to create the same idea here. And again, the behavioral aspect of it is now in a way we're using the behavioral economics in the sense of committing people in stage 1 to act a certain way so we can use them in stage 2. Now is that, yeah, that's behavioral. I mean, that's using something we know from observing how people behave to get them to behave more like we want them to behave. Okay, so the example of the results here. So here we have bids, and here we have, oh sorry, what do we have here? Bids here, and we have the distribution here. Sorry, that's 100% out there. And so what you can see is the hypothetical bids are collecting up here, and we get a whole bunch of them clustered up here at just giving us the full amount of their endowment, which was 30. Right? So in a sense, their budget constraint really wasn't that binding. Now the real bids, and I thought real was real and real was best, but now we're talking about nearly 40% giving €1 to adopt a dolphin. Get out of here, I don't believe it. Right? I mean, when we ran those baseball cards experiments, so the original baseball card experiments were at a Denver sports card show in the middle of the afternoon. You had a bunch of sports nuts there. Who else would be in a baseball card show in the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday unless people who loved sports and loved the idea of sports memorabilia? So when we ran those and we found there was a big gap between hypothetical and real, we said, ah, yeah, see, hypotheticals is bad. But if you actually go back and look at the data again later, found that 60% of the real bids were 0. And it's like, no, this is wrong. We did this wrong. Wait, we violated a constraint that I hadn't even thought about. And if you're a mechanism design guy, you would have thought about it in a second, you know, the participation constraint. So if you design an auction in the field and you design an auction in the lab and you don't control for the participation constraint, the best way out of an auction is to bid 0. And I mean, if you can't just, you're in the auction, you're not just going to walk out then. You're in the experiment, so you're bidding 0 to essentially opt out of the auction without even worrying about it. And thinking about how we designed the earlier baseball card experiments, I can see it, because it was hypothetical. Yes, get your bid. Oh, and by the way, now you can buy it for real. And it kind of felt like a bait and switch, you know. So in some ways that experiment, yeah, a little bait and switch going on. Now you're going to buy it for real. And then people are like, I'm not going to buy it for real. 0. So for the dolphin, I violated sort of 2 constraints. Budget constraint for hypothetical, participation constraint for real. And so if I think the oath is going to work, I'm going to think that the oath is going to help me correct both violations. Right? That the guys who are just bidding to bid will come down. The people who are opting out because they just will come up. Okay? If I think this commitment device works. And lucky for us, these bids came up, those bids came down. The oath seemed to move things in the direction we would expect based on rational reaction to commitment, which is not to over-exaggerate, which is not to try to opt out. And so that blue line then is the oath representing the distribution over the bids. And so we ran that many different times, many different ways, with and without cheap talk, with and without experience, and the pattern was about the same. So the eyeball test, right? I mean, if you run the eyeball test, the oath seemed to do what we asked it to do. We got them to commit to tell the truth, regardless of the context, real or hypothetical, right? We got them to give us the truth, and experience didn't seem to matter, cheap talk didn't seem to matter. This oath thing seemed to work. We've run it on a referendum. We had the same effect on a referendum. It seemed to work. We've run it on lying experiments where people can can lie and make an advantage, or lie a little white lie so you're helped and I'm helped. And what happens in the oath in that case is when we run lies, but we don't explicitly say you're lying, the oath doesn't work. But when we say to them, if you do this, you're lying, then the oath works. Okay, now I'm drifting out of my economic zone. You know, why is it when you tell a person that they're about to lie, it works, versus it's obvious you're lying? You know, I mean, I guess if you hold up a mirror, but now I'm uncomfortable. Right? I don't know how to put a price on holding up a mirror to lying. We've run coordination games using this oath to try to, about communication and coordination. And we found that in that case, the oath bumped things up a good 60% in terms of ability to coordinate, because now the sender of a signal is more likely to tell the truth, and the receiver is less skeptical. The receiver is not 100% absorb them, but they're less skeptical than they otherwise would be. So this real commitment, real economic commitment without exchange through the oath, to me is fascinating. I mean, I could spend the next 10 years running different oaths, right? Oaths on your mother, oaths on your children, oaths on collective oaths. Why is it that we have collective oaths versus individual oaths, versus oaths on Bible versus oaths on, you know, I mean, why? Why all these institutions pop up, and what does it mean in terms of commitment and economic commitment? I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating to me. And yeah, so we keep running these oath experiments, and so far the only people who seem to be interested in them are me and my colleagues. Everybody else is like, what? What is this? So someday maybe we got one of them published so far. All the other ones are people who are like, well, that's obvious. I said, well, okay, ex post obvious, right? But ex ante it's not obvious, and I'm sorry that we made it look obvious ex post. We'll write it up more like a murder mystery next time. Okay? So if I think about this, you know, we've a long time, you know, economists love to push our ideas on other people. But man, we are certainly prickly when people try to push their ideas on us. And, you know, will this behavioral environmental economics provide more protection at less cost? Well, right now, the biggest examples are energy and water. The stuff Mike Price and Paul Ferreira are doing on introducing these information sources and, you know, programs, these big programs, testing, and what we got to see is whether or not these nudges and incentives are actually policy tools that are going to stick. I think the one paper that was in the AER lead issue was behavioral nudges that backfire on health insurance. It was an adverse selection model that was sometime in the last year. And what I'm worried about in this context is just that. If we've got a market failure and we have a behavioral failure, now you got the classic second best problem. Two failures. You correct one, say put a Pigouvian tax on environmental failure, but you don't do anything about the behavioral failure, whatever it happens to be. Could you exaggerate the problem? Or you correct the behavioral failure, but you don't do anything about the environmental failure or the institutional failure. Could you exacerbate that problem? And one sort of example I've seen is this adverse selection medical paper that that's probably why it was the lead article, is he found an example where, you know, this behavioral economics backfired. If he had found it worked, everybody said, well, whatever. But now that it backfired, it's like, oh yeah, see, we warned you guys. Don't mess with psychology in a general equilibrium framework, because it'll come back. The partial equilibrium framework, all is well, but put it in a general equilibrium framework with two market failures, things could come back and bite you. Now, whether that happens in environmental, I think that would be a great dissertation. Or a career, actually. I mean, I think it would be, there's no shortage of things to think about. Other opinions, and I was kind of curious about this. John Elster, he's like, no, behavioral environmental economics isn't going to help, because This is just way too complex. You're in over your head. You're doing little, you're cherry picking. Okay? It's way too contextual ever to be integrated. Herb Gintis, yeah. And he's got a book on evolutionary game theory where he's trying to integrate everything into it. And I went through that book, and I got to the end, and he said, and I'll finish it in the next book. So it was kind of like, it's like, Hunger Games Part 2. You got to wait another year for the movie to find out how it ends. But he thinks he can do it with evolutionary game theory. He thinks he can integrate it all in, and I guess I'll wait for Part 2 to be convinced. Bob Sugden doesn't think it matters. You can have as many incoherent preferences as you want as long as you've got some kind of arbitrage mechanism that's moving things along to create market coherence. You don't have to have individual coherence. You've got market coherence. And he's demonstrated theoretically how preferences can be as goofy as you want them to be, and as long as they're moving in this direction of more to less, you prefer more to less. And it's the same going back to that old paper by Good and Sunder where they took those econobots and programmed them. They weren't thinking at all, and all they did was prefer more to less and threw them in a double auction. It acted as if they were all geniuses, and they really were robots. Ariel Rubinstein is doubtful. He thinks this behavioral approach has got us because we're a culture and not a science, right? That somehow we're being swept along because this is the latest fad. And I know one of our professors in finance in our department, that's exactly his view. He's just like, yeah, I'll wait it out, right? I mean, it's all going to go away. One of the guys who won the Clark Bates, Raj Chetty, the Eli lecture that'll come out here soon in the May edition of the AER. He's the young guy. He's taking a very pragmatic approach in that paper. Use what works, throw out what doesn't. Okay, I can buy that. And he goes through some examples on savings and where you choose to live, and it's a nice paper to get an overview of. Let's not go crazy here. Let's figure out what works and why and how you can use it to our advantage. If all of this stuff, I'm much more down here in this pragmatic approach in terms of if it works and I can get better environmental protection at lower costs, I'll try it. I'll do it. If it doesn't work or if it backfires, yeah, stop. So those are the questions that are motivating me now in terms of trying to understand this interaction. Behavioral failure, just another form of market failure. The reason these things pop out is because we don't have a market, and maybe the only solution we can have in environmental is cap and trade, because we've filled in a missing market with cap and trade, and now the market moves us as if we're rational, and we don't have to worry about all this anomaly stuff. So, the guys up in PERC, up in Montana, are right. Political Economy Research Center, right? They're all free market environmentalism, Terry Anderson. They're just right. And the second one I've already raised is behavioral environmental second best problem. That one troubles me still because I haven't sorted it out yet. But if you did a cap and trade, you corrected the market failure with a cap and trade, and the behavioral failures don't matter then because you have a strong enough market, it should work. Unless there's adverse selection. Or unless there's some kind of moral hazard. So that's what I've been up to. And this is what interests me in this whole interface and why working with ecologists and non-economists is so interesting because, that initial Venn diagram is like a big sandbox, and you can choose where you want to go depending on what problem you're interested in studying and which one matters to you and which one you think is the driver and how you want to do it. We didn't talk anything about all the bioeconomic models we've built, but I've been pushing hard on my colleagues and my co-authors. We need to add in some non-standard utility functions into these models and see how they blow up. We need to see what happens to predictions about zebra mussels in the Columbia River Basin if we throw in some kind of prospect theory or some kind of weighted utility theory or reference dependence, some kind of utility function to see if it matters in a general equilibrium world. You know, the more of these things we can test drive in a GE model or in a climate change GE model. I mean, what if everybody is loss averse in a climate change GE model? What happens then as opposed to a standard utility function? I mean, that to me, I haven't seen that. I want to see that work because I want to see if it really even makes a difference. We did it for hyperbolic discounting in an integrated model on the cutthroat trout and found that, you know, the behavioral economics, the hyperbolic discounting is you start out at a high discount rate and then it gets lower as time goes on as opposed to exponential. And we found that the only time that it mattered is when the costs were the least. So it's like, yeah, it matters, but it doesn't matter. You know, there's a gap, but the gap is trivial. So, okay, throw in your behavioral stuff, doesn't matter. But we need to know that kind of stuff before we can just, you know, categorize it as quirky behavior, especially for non-market exchange. To me, that's the key. And if we can understand that and document those, then I'll be way easier about going back to my utility function with W and being happy and ignoring all the unbounded emotions of the world, right? I mean, that's what I started realizing. If I want to really read about unbounded emotions, I'm going to read Shakespeare, not economists. So, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, those were hypothetical with the oath. Yeah. We found in induced evaluation experiments when we ran real with the oath, it got worse. And I can ex post rationalize it as crowding out, but I mean, I just said, wow, that's not good. You know. Yeah. Oh, I think what I showed you was when we said up to 5. So, yeah. No, I should probably change that 1 to 5 instead of 6 because we've done them both ways, but the one I showed you was 5. Yeah. So they wanted their money. They didn't hold back, but they could have. But there might be some demand effect in there, and that they can retire up to 5, and so people are just like, I'll just retire all 5. But they made the most money retiring all 5. So yeah. Yes, sir. Right, and then, yeah, so then my question always is, which theta do you want to introduce to explain it? Do you want to use guilt aversion to explain it, right? Mm-hmm. If you can identify all the conditions that relate to which theta pops up, absolutely. Absolutely. If you can map that out and you can separate and assume separability between the thetas so that it's a clean mapping, then I'm all for it. And so what I'm concerned about is not a clean mapping, and they're not separable. And if it's not a complete mapping and it's not separable, then I feel like we're spending a lot of time figuring out this mapping when I can just make an institution that just sweeps it under the rug. Okay? Well, I did say on one of the slides, are the institutions that I designed reasonable? And do you want to hang out with the people that are in the institutions I've made? Right? And no, not necessarily. I mean, when I was at the Yale Forestry School, I got a bunch of students, and they're all, Yale Forestry, Save the World, tree huggers. We'll do this together. And I brought them all in the room, and I set up a bargaining tournament that had $250 for the winner, $125 for the loser, just like a golf tournament, winner take all, nonlinear payoff. And I set them loose on each other. Forget the fairness, forget the agreeing, forget the equity, man, forget efficiency. They were just like outside option, and they just, it was, I just watched them all, and they knew each other, and they were friends. I gave them permission to be self-interested. Now, do I want to hang out with them? Not in that context, because it'd always be looking around my back. I wanted to hang out with them when they were Yale students hanging out being, green and stuff, and friendly and buying me beer or whatever it was, as opposed to waiting for me to buy them beer. But just by that switch in the rules in that tournament, and I guess I got this way early on by watching, running bargaining experiments and thinking I had total control, and watching the students walk down the hall and seeing them cut side deals as they walked down the hall, and I realized, wow, I've missed it. So then the next time I brought them in, I made them into teams and set them out like a wrestling tournament. Lightweights against lightweights, heavyweights against heavyweights. You had to get points back for your team. There were no more side deals. So to me, it's this power of that institution that I don't want to explain that mapping. Colin Kammerer and the Nero guys and, the eyeballs and, and all that stuff, man, if they can get that mapping and they can explain it, all the power to them. I want to understand the institutions that we've designed that give you permission to be self-interested. And then as I start relaxing that institution, which emotions pop up? Do they all pop up? Does one pop up? Which one? Because, man, if you grew up in the church, like I did, there's just stuff coming out every which way, and you're trying to figure out which one's driving what, and I don't know how to do it. Yeah. Right. Econobots. Yeah. Well, that's what the crowding out guys believe, right? The crowding out literature is you start adding in those pricing incentives, start driving out the people who are doing the right thing for the right reason, all of a sudden stop doing the right thing for the right reason. And then the question is, how persistent is that? Those are the earliest public goods experiments, if you remember Maxwell et al. Way back when, economists free ride to anybody else. And that was one of the first public goods experiments that started saying, look at all these people cooperating. What is going on here? Why are economists all bent to, what? This is wrong when this is actually good. And then Robert Frank has sort of made the same argument that, we're teaching people to free ride in economics classes. They don't free ride, but they come to economics classes and they learn that's what you're supposed to do if you're rational. is the free ride. Well, yeah. So I'm not disagreeing. But at the same time, I'm not a spiritual guide either. So I'm trying to be positive about creating these institutions, and then I can say, is that the kind of world I want to live in? If it's that cutthroat, or maybe that is the world I live in if that institution is driving behavior. But Sam Bowles has worked a lot on this crowding out stuff. He's got a nice survey paper in Science 3, 4, 5 years ago that talks about this pressure of paying people. I mean, the big example was the one that's always held up is the Israeli child care one, right? Where, when you started fining people started showing up late to pick up their kids. But then if you actually looked at it, it was like $5 an hour for babysitting. Boom, I'm there. I'll pick up my kid an hour late for $5. Once they started charging $1 per minute, nobody was late. Right? So there was a little question on whether that experiment was any good or not. But that's the beauty of experiments. It's like people can pinpoint and say, well, that was a good story, but $5 an hour cheap babysitting, that's not crowding out. That's pretty dang rational to me. Lower your expectations. The way I always done it is I never say I'm an experimental economist. I'm a guy who's interested in experiments, and here's kind of what I'm doing. Right? I'm trying to learn a little bit more about how people are interacting with non-market exchange, which is just a step away from the environment. But if we can understand that, then maybe, we can understand this. And so going back to the baseball card stuff, one of the big things was, how do you deliver a non-market good in the lab? People tried paintings, and people tried blenders, and people tried different things. And so the baseball card thing for me the appeal was an esoteric idea of just this thin little thing worth very much money to certain amounts of people, that you could do it out in the field and you can do whatever. And you were getting closer and closer to reality through this this tangible thing had ethereal values. And that's still a hard sell to the environmental crowd, because you're not exactly going after climate change here. You're not talking about, shifting environmental regimes, but you're at least getting an idea that you're one step closer to it. And then all of a sudden, boom, everybody's out in the field running field experiments like crazy, and all of a sudden you're not experimentalists again unless you're running a field experiment, and now everybody's moving one step closer to reality. And so that big movement, I think, went a long way in satisfying a lot of that criticism, because now we've kind of moved it closer. And now if you can get to a natural experiment, now you got the randomized control treatments and all the poverty action lab stuff, and the millions of experiments that are being run as I speak right now around Esther Duflo must have 1 million publications by now, because she has 1 million projects around the world. And I just go to that place, and there's like an experiment, there's like 100 experiments around the globe going on right now that all will end up in the AER, and it's like, wow. So I think, I'm willing to have taken the first bullets and let all the field experiment people go crazy and get closer to it, But Charlie Plott made the best argument in the sense that, you got real people exchanging real money in a real context, doing real things. If that ain't reality, I don't know what is. And if you want to make it more complex, make it more complex. If you want to stretch it out and add in more moving parameters, stretch it out. But that's science, right? So Yeah, existence value. That's what we called it when we were trying to measure like the value of grizzly bears. And when they did the Exxon Valdez oil spill, right? So the people who were trying to value it didn't value anyone in Alaska where the oil spill was. They surveyed only people in the lower 48 for their existence value of knowing that Prince Edward Sound was pristine. The blowback is sympathy and economic value, right? And that's what Milgram and some of these top flight guys came back with that were working for Exxon, that pushed it back down to say, you know, I don't know if Douglas worked on this on any of the Exxon Valdez, but it was, you know, pretty contentious for thinking about future generations, options values, existence values. The quest values was another one when we were trying to debundle these values. Nowadays we just call them passive use values, I think is the latest term, because passive use values. Okay. And that's a lot of the contingent valuation game is almost nomenclature, because nowadays it's no longer hypothetical versus real, it's consequential versus inconsequential. It might be hypothetical, but there might be a consequence on public policy, and that's what the person's valuing. So it is a real thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. Well, no, I mean, the Nature Conservancy is an interesting group, because the vast majority of them, I don't think they have to worry about money themselves, personally, right? And so there's a few of us who still have to worry about money. And so what comes along is to sort of do the right thing for the right reason, and we'll all sort of move this forward, and then my job is to say, but how much does it cost? And that's what the Nature Conservancy folks who work for them say, what does it cost? But the board itself is like, let's just do it. And then they're like, oh, okay, well, we can't do everything. And so that kind of interjection, and so I've added the ideas of agglomeration bonuses to them. I've tried to convince them that it's worth thinking about, you know, subsidies to aggregate fragmented stuff. And they're not, you know, they don't go, oh, that's crazy. They're like, oh, yeah, okay. But the big debate in the Nature Conservancy and all the biological conservation is whether you just conserve to conserve, or do you include people in the conservation policy. I mean, you can find, just even in this last 2 months in Science or Nature, this hostile, I mean, nasty. You thought experimental economists were catty. These guys were just after it, in that you should just be preserving nature for nature's sake, sort of the Soule view of, you know, setting aside 40% of the U.S. just for nature, versus the Peter Corellia angle that people count, and you got to count for, and the Nature Conservancy boss who says you got to count for this. So, yeah, they're having a real sort of existential moment in trying to do it, and it's obvious when you sit in the meetings that some people are way over here and some people are way over here. It's an interesting board to be part of, no doubt. I would think the Texas board would be incredibly interesting, yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I mean, think about it this way, right? There's really flat payoffs in a physical sense when you're dealing with environmental goods. I mean, you got parts per billion, right? And you're deviating parts per billion. So if you deviate 2 parts per billion, I mean, if you look physically, it's a pretty flat frontier. And so how do you get people to optimally choose along that flat frontier? Well, spike the rewards, right? And so that's why you would have the tournament structure, is essentially take that flat physical frontier and transform it into a spiked monetary frontier, and then wait for people to fight over. It's, you know, it's like, we remember we brought up the identity question, you know, why do swimmers swim? Because I'm a swimmer. Well, and they also have a spiked frontier. If you win a gold medal, Michael Phelps, you know, I mean, 11 gold medals, you know, I'm sure he's, you know, got enough money in the bank to. We had one chapter in a book once for environmental goods. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's that bargaining tournament I set up. It was like March Madness, and it was. Everybody was going for it. And it was fun to watch because I was like, yes. Made these tree-hugging altruists into economists. Yeah, well, graduation will do that too. Yeah, so I guess that's why I said at the beginning, I'm behavioral economics. I'm not really a behavioral economist, but I'm not really institutional economist. I'm interested in the interactions of the two. I don't know what you call that. A guy interested in the interactions of the two, applied to environmental problems. Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.